You ever feel like the city is safe until a single second proves it wrong? I was 19, alone on a night bus in New York. Then a man stepped out, opened his coat, and everything changed. Stay with me, this isn't just one scary moment. It's what I did afterwards that mattered. If you want honest stories about what actually happens late at night, subscribe now. It was almost midnight when I left the hospital that night. The hospital smells had clung to me all evening. Antiseptic and coffee and that quiet sorrow that lives in waiting rooms. My mom had been there for a procedure, and I had promised I would wait until she fell asleep. She squeezed my hand and told me to get home safe. She said it more than once, like it might make it true. I didn't have the cash for a cab, and the trains didn't run the route I needed that late, so I walked to the bus shelter on the mall. New York at night is a different animal. Half of it is magical, lights bleeding into dark water. The other half is raw and honest, and that rawness makes you more aware of every footstep, every shadow. I pulled my coat around me, shoved my phone into my pocket, and stepped into the lit plexiglass of the bus shelter. It felt like a little glass island of safety against the cold and the emptiness. The bus shelter was empty except for me. The lights inside made everything sharp. The metal bench, the glossy sidewalk, the faint steam curling up from a manhole cover down the block. I told myself not to be silly. I told myself I knew how to be careful, that I'd taken buses home alone 100 times. Still, being 19 and alone at midnight makes your eyes too big for your face. Then I saw him. He was walking at a steady clip down the center of the mall. Not stumbling, not ducking into shadows. He walked like someone who had decided the world would make room for him and he was going to find a space. He had a long dark coat, and his steps hit the pavement in the rhythm that makes your skin crawl, slow, purposeful, like the beat of a metronome. He stopped a few yards away and looked at me. I saw the outline of his face in the glow of the streetlight. 40 maybe or older. A beard that hadn't seen a razor in a week. Eyes that were too bright in the dark. He didn't walk past. He stopped and watched me, like I was a show on glass. Then he opened his coat. For a moment my brain stalled. The world reduced to shape and sound and an impossible movement. A coat flung open like a curtain for a cruel spectacle. I remember the thin sound of the wind, and then the most absurd thing happened. I laughed. Not because I thought it was funny. Because the body does strange things when your brain is trying to protect you. That laugh slipped out of me. A small and frantic sound. I looked at him, and before I could rein it back in I said, almost in disbelief, "Okay, that's a penis. Smaller than expected." The look that washed over his face was the exact opposite of what he must have been after. For a man who'd clearly decided he had control, I guess embarrassment was a new emotion. He snapped his coat shut, muttered something that was half a curse and half surprise, and turned away, then ran. He ran into the shadow of the street and disappeared like a bad dream. I sat there for a beat. The shelter hummed with cheap fluorescent light. My hands trembled. I felt like I had been dressed down in some private theater and then abandoned in the lobby. Part of me was shaking with adrenaline. Part of me had this light, hollow bubble of laughter that felt like a shield. I had laughed to defend myself without choosing to be brave. When the bus finally arrived, I got on and sat near the front under the yellow globe of the driver's lamp. The man in the driver's uniform glanced at me with a question in his eyes and didn't ask. He didn't have to. I climbed down the stairs when my stop came and walked the 2 blocks to my building. I remember unlocking my door and pressing my back against it. Like if I leaned hard enough I could keep the memory out of the room with me. It's strange how immediate fear can be, and how slow it heals. The next morning I woke with the city already moving. People on their way to somewhere important. Coffee in hands, subway breath steaming by the stoop. The earth kept spinning. The subway had not paused for me. The story kept playing in my head in slow motion. The way his boots hit the pavement. The smirk that never left his face when he thought he'd get his reaction. What pissed me off more than the exposure was the intention behind it. To frighten, to shame, to bully me into silence. I thought of his eyes as he tried for dominance and failed. I thought of the fragility in his swagger. There was something small and pathetic about the entire act, and I clung to that sliver of perspective because it let me breathe. I called the NYPD's non-emergency line. My hands were still a little shaky as I explained the time and place and description. The operator said the words she had to say. "We'll note this and increase patrols in that area." She told me they get this type of call a lot. Her voice was calm, not dismissive, just routine. It was small comfort, and yet it was something. It could have ended there, an odd night, a recorded incident, an email to the NYPD. Instead, it opened something up. I realized I didn't want my reaction, laughing in the bus shelter, to be the last word. I didn't want this to be a private moment I swallowed and forgot, because forgotten acts like that become a pattern. They multiply in the dark. So I did something small that felt huge. I told a friend. I texted screenshots of the sketchy part of the mall and the time frame. I told my roommate. I told my sister. The shock on their faces was immediate. Not because of the explicitness of what happened, but because it wasn't unusual. It was a story they'd heard, or a story one of their friends had lived through. I wasn't alone. The first few nights after the incident, I found myself thinking about walking the line between paranoia and prudence. New York expects you to be sharp, to be alert, to carry your keys between your fingers and your phone pressed to your ear as if that tiny ritual will save you. But surviving the city doesn't have to be an exercise in constant fear. It has to be an exercise in care. I wanted to convert my anger into something useful. A week later, I went back to the same stop by choice. Not because I wanted to test fate, I didn't, but because I wanted to reframe the script. I stood under the shelter's light on purpose, arms crossed, and I let myself feel the city's night breath. The bus came and I rode to the next stop. The man in the coat did not reappear. But something else did. A patrol car idling a few blocks away. More people around the corner making small talk. A street vendor packing up his cart. The environment didn't change overnight, and neither did I. But I had decided not to be a passive inhabitant of my own life. Then I made a post on a local community forum. Not dramatic, just a clear account with the time, location, and a note that the intersection felt unsafe that week. I didn't post the detail of what he'd done. I didn't need to. The reaction was mixed. A few supportive comments, 1 or 2 skeptical replies, and several messages from women saying, "This happened to me too." Their words were quiet and full of gratitude that someone finally said it out loud. A private investigator who read the post reached out to me through a friend. He had a note. There had been a string of similar incidents reported to him by women in some of the same neighborhoods lately. Not the same man, not necessarily, but the same MO, someone preying on the invisibility of late-night commuters. He suggested compiling more accounts. It was the slimmest thread of something real, but real enough to act on. I agreed to help. We began to collect stories. Not for sensationalism, but for data. A woman in Queens reported a similar incident near a laundromat. Another in Brooklyn said she'd seen a man attempt the same thing at a bus stop near Atlantic Avenue. For every woman who sent a terse line, "This happened to me on February 12th. There were 3 more who replied privately with details they weren't comfortable sharing publicly. We found patterns. Late hours, empty stops, similar clothing, and a sense of bravado. It wasn't comfortable work. It was necessary. I began to speak up more publicly about the problem. At first it was small, an op-ed for a local blog, then a spot on a neighborhood safety forum. People began to share their nightmares and their coping methods. A transit worker wrote in about how they had tried to change scheduling but didn't have enough bodies to staff some routes. An organizer from a local shelter suggested self-defense classes in community centers. The momentum grew like a small crack becoming a crack in the sidewalk. Slow, then insistent. One night, I was contacted by a reporter from a city paper. They wanted to run a piece on the rise of this kind of harassment, not because it made good headlines, but because the data suggested a pattern. When the article ran, it was measured, careful, and human. It included statistics, but also the stories we had collected. It emphasized resources, hotlines, transit safety numbers, local community centers offering workshops. Someone in City Hall read it. Someone at the Transit Authority read it. The authority mentioned it in their next public safety meeting. It circled out into a bureaucracy that sometimes feels like it only moves when someone nudges it hard enough. I had never intended to be that nudge. I was a kid who had laughed at the worst moment of her life, and later that week she had used that nervous laugh as a first step. The truth was I didn't feel like a crusader. I felt tired, wary, and, sometimes, embarrassed that something like this had happened to me. But the small decision to speak had given other people permission to speak. The small act of cataloging incidents gave the police reason to patrol. The small op-ed gave transit staff cause to review lighting and cameras at certain stops. And then, 2 months after the incident, a man was arrested. He hadn't done exactly what happened to me, but he had been implicated in a string of indecent exposures in several boroughs. The arrest was not a dramatic cinematic moment in which I was given a hero's cape. It was a quiet police procedural, a testimony, a line of evidence, neighborhood tips that converged. But the arc of it felt like something I had helped begin. There were no parades, no medals, just an email from a detective saying our reports had helped. There was a short, private meeting where I gave a statement, and later I received a note that charges were filed. What the arrest did, more than anything, was make the conversation legitimate. Transit officials agreed to increase patrols on late-night routes for the next year. Several community centers started free self-defense classes targeted to late-night commuters. A light-up poster campaign was launched in shelters encouraging people to report harassment and to look out for each other. It wasn't a cure-all. It was incremental. But the point was this: our horror had become a lever for change. Sometimes the city still feels dangerous. That never fully leaves you, but the shape of the fear changed. It was no longer only about the random cruelty of strangers. It had become activism, community, an organized refusal to accept the status quo. I felt less alone, and that is often the most powerful thing. When I tell the story now, I don't end at the coat flung open. I start at the hospital room where I kissed my mother's forehead. I tell how someone tried to use humiliation as control, and how I, by accident and then by choice, pushed back. I tell how a laugh became a phone call, became a small post that turned into data and then into patrols. I tell it in a way that lets people know they aren't helpless. That reporting, even when it feels like shouting into the wind, sometimes lands on an ear that can act. There are nights I still pass that mall, and sometimes there are still men who watch from the corner. I walk a little faster now, but I also walk a little more openly. Where I used to look over my shoulder, I now look straight ahead. Not because the fear is gone, but because the city is no longer a place where silence is always the only option. This is not a story with a tidy moral. It's messy. It's personal. It's the kind of thing that leaves you rattled and stronger at once. I still teach a self-defense class part-time at a community center, not as a hero, but as someone who learned the hard way and wanted to give others a choice. If anything, the last thing I want people to take from this is the illusion that you can live without risk. You can't. But you can use small acts, a post, a phone call, a shared story to push back. In New York, the city keeps moving. But sometimes, if enough people speak, it moves a little toward safety. I laughed because it kept me human. I spoke because silence lets harm grow. That night taught me that the bravest thing can be telling the truth.